This is Carolina Ghost Towns, a podcast about the vanished towns and lost communities in South Carolina, North Carolina, and maybe a few other places. I'm your host, Tom Taylor. Welcome to a special bonus episode of Carolina Ghost Towns. Back in March, I did a talk for the Greenville County Library on the lost towns under South Carolina's lakes. Michael Evans, the director of the Mauldin Branch of the library, invited me to come back and do another talk, this time on the lost railroad towns of South Carolina. As with the last talk, I recorded it, and I'm posting it here in its entirety as a bonus episode. And, as with the last talk, some of the towns I discuss in the lecture have been covered in other episodes, usually in more detail. Again, I had a few technical problems. I had two recorders going and was wearing a lavalier microphone, and I still haven't gotten the hang of the recorder I was using for questions and for room audio. Fortunately, my main recorder was working, and my lapel mic picked up some of the questions and comments. I tried to boost the volume of those questions, and they were a bit stark in the overall context of the rest of the audio. I hate the phrase, "it is what it is," but that's the situation here right now. Anyway, here's the lecture. Enjoy. First of all, I'll give you a little bit of an introduction. I am Tom Taylor. My wife Laura is back here in the back. I started off as a teacher. I was a music teacher, taught middle school chorus for a long time, taught fourth grade, just a regular fourth grade, got into instructional technology. And then for the last part of my career, I was the director of technology for Spartanburg School District 5. So retired from that, 12 and a half years ago, wow. And have been pursuing my own interests, which include kayaking, photography, and still doing a lot of music. In fact, I played at Fall for Greenville yesterday, so that was a lot of fun. I play banjo. But to give you a little bit more background, I grew up in Lawrence County. I was one of 7 kids, and my dad loved to ramble, and he passed that love along to us. And what he would do is he'd load all of us into the Pontiac and would take us all over Lawrence County first, and then basically anywhere in the upstate region. And some of the towns you're going to see today are some of the towns that he took us to. But I always became fascinated with those locations and wondered, well, why is it gone? What happened to it? And, why are there these ruins that we can see here? So what happened to this town? And so I started digging into it a lot more. But in the last few years, I've been making it more of a vocation rather than just actually a passing interest. I've been for a long time trying to put together a book. I don't know if that'll ever happen. But one thing I have been doing is a podcast called Carolina Ghost Towns. I just started it this year. It comes out every other Tuesday. Right now, I've kind of put it on hold because we've been dealing with some issues with Hurricane Helene, as I'm sure several of you have. But it covers ghost towns all over the Southeast and not just the Carolinas. We've done some North Carolina, South Carolina, some in Georgia. I've even done one in Washington State that actually has a connection to North Carolina. I'm hoping to have season 2 come up this winter. I've got a couple of bonus episodes coming up soon, one of which I'm hoping will be this presentation. You see that I'm wearing a microphone, I'm recording it here, and I'm getting another recording here. If anyone has an issue with that, let me know and I can stop the recording, okay? Any problems? Is that okay with everybody? Okay, good, we'll continue. So the first question is, what is a ghost town? Anybody know? What's a ghost town? Very good answer. You're in 4th grade, going into 5th grade, right? Okay, yeah. All right. A deserted town. Any other ideas of what a ghost town is?
Ellington.
Ellington, yes. Ellington is a ghost town. But if you were to describe the quintessential ghost town, how would you describe it?
Abandoned.
Okay. I'm hearing deserted, I'm hearing abandoned.
No industry.
No industry, okay. Yeah, a lot of times people will refer to a place that is populated, oh, that's now a ghost town, because there's not much goes on there. Sometimes you even hear it in the paranormal sense, oh, it's full of ghosts. I don't focus on that, but some people do. A lot of times when you're thinking of a ghost town, you think of something like this. One of these western ghost towns, out Wild West, gunfights, all that. This is Calico Ghost Town in California. Well, eastern ghost towns are not like this for several reasons. First of all, that's an arid climate, and those towns are going to survive, especially the wooden ones, a little bit more than they would in this hot, humid area where things tend to rot, decay, and fall into ruin a little more so than there. The other reason is you just simply have to look across the road over here at the apartment complexes that are going up. We have a much denser population area, and so you have a lot of wide space out west where these towns are not becoming consumed by urban sprawl, at least not yet, and we'll hope that does not happen. But here, we've got towns that are closer together, especially in the upstate. All the apartments complexes popping up. In fact, I was talking with somebody just a week ago, Monday, and I called the community he lived in. He said, well, that's on my ghost town list. I said, well, how could it be there? There's all these apartments here. And I said, well, it kind of qualifies. Well, what makes it a ghost town? National Park Service has put together a scale. And Class A is a completely barren site. There had been a town there, not anything there anymore. Class B is rubble and our roofless buildings remain. And we'll see a couple of those in tonight's presentation. Class C, standing abandoned buildings with no population. That would probably be more like the Calico ghost town that you saw there. And we'll look at a couple of those. Semi-near abandoned towns with small populations. There are a lot of those. I visited, I think it's Mayfield, which is in Sumter County. And the downtown is just completely abandoned, but there's actually a few houses that are still there. Same with one of the ghost towns we'll look at today. Class E is a busy historic community. I can think of two examples of that in South Carolina. Historic Brattonsville up in, I think, York County, and historic Dorchester down in Dorchester County. A restored town or a state park with a historical old town. Maybe Brattonsville might be on the edge of that. But another one I can think of is Willington, which is on the railroad, and they're really trying to restore that as a historic area. Class G is what we're going to see a lot of here, which is absorbed into a neighboring city. A good example of that one is the town of Hamburg. You may have never heard of that. You're going to hear about it tonight. It's not one of the ones I'm going to be talking about, but I'll be referring to it. It has now been absorbed by North Augusta, and it's an interesting story all on its own. Class H, no original buildings remaining on site. That doesn't mean that there aren't buildings on the area, but all the original ones are now gone. So that's the national park scale. I read of another one. Didn't put up a slide because it's very intricate, where this guy took that scale and broke it down even further. And it's a good way to understand it, but for now, that's a good enough overview. Towns become ghost towns for a lot of reasons. And today we're going to look specifically at how transportation patterns affect cities. For example, a lot of the early towns were settled along rivers, bays, things like that. And as those modes of transportation became less important and railroads took over, then those towns tended to die out. Same thing with railroads. During the 1800s, That was your main mode of transportation across the state. And what would happen was you had all of these different railroad stops, so the train would stop there. And then you didn't have very good roads or anything. You either took a wagon, stagecoach, or horse to get to your farm or wherever it is away from the town. What happened then is that automobiles replaced the rails. The highways were improved. In the early 1900s, with the invention of the automobile or the prevalence of the automobile, you had what was called the Good Roads movement. And they were pushing to get better highways. And that pretty much killed out the railroad transportation. Then, subsequently, you get interstates. And we all know the story of a small town that's bypassed by the interstate. And you have McDonald's and gas stations and everything pop up at the interstate exit, and not much in the former town itself. So all of these changes in transportation affect what happens to businesses and population within those former civic centers. Now, South Carolina was actually the first state in the United States to have regular passenger rail service. It started in 1827 with a railroad, an engine known as the Best Friend of Charleston. And initially, it only went from Charleston here just a few miles out. But eventually, it went from Charleston to Hamburg. There's that town I mentioned to you. It was located right across from Augusta. So the Hamburg to Charleston rail line was the very first passenger rail service in the United States. Right here, they had a branch that would go off to Columbia and up to Camden, which were the two major cities in South Carolina on the interior at that time. This town right here popped up at that location, and it was known as Branchville because that's where the railroad branched. That's still a thriving town. It is not one of our ghost towns. Now, by 1870, South Carolina had 1,210 miles of railroad. And this was both for passenger service, this was for commercial industrial service, and a lot of different companies owned little bits and pieces of these railroads. Now, I know you cannot see the comment up here, but one thing I want to point out is that a lot of these rails were destroyed during the Civil War. They were intentionally destroyed. And we'll describe what happened to that in the course of looking at a couple of the towns that we see here. Now, this map is from an excellent website. I highly recommend it. It's called Carolina, not Lina. So notice that there's an A instead of an I here. And if you want to know anything about North or South Carolina and its history and its towns, I highly recommend going to that website. It's great. Now, you guys were looking at this map earlier. This is an 1880 map. It's the Hotchkiss Railroad map. And it's the one that I've been using as a background for some of my slides. I know that you can't see it very well, but it does show there's the Charleston to Hamburg Railroad, and there are others that are there, but I've got some better views of it. So, for example, this is actually an 1870 map, so it's 10 years earlier than the Hotchkiss map. This one was one that was showing the Port Royal Railroad. But looking back at this Charleston to Augusta map, you see all of these stops, all of these town names here. Looking on upwards, you've got other towns. There's Manchester, Kingsville, Watery Junction, Louisville. I'd never heard of that one. Fort Mott. All of these towns. And we could spend an entire week just looking at all of these different towns. Here's the one that you mentioned, Ellington, right here. If we look at that same map and look a little closer to home, this is a view of it, of the upstate. You see some names that you don't recognize there? Can you see those? There's some you do see, like Pickens County is Greenville, Spartanburg, Yorkville, Unionville, Chesterville. Notice how they appended Ville to the ends of these names, in the earlier ones. But here's Newberry, and in the same font size is Helena, or I guess it is Helena and not Helena. I figure that's the case, but there's some other ones here. Let's see here. Littleton, Alston is another large area, and right now that's a really cool place because it's part of the Palmetto Trail, and you can walk across the old railroad bridge across the Broad River. So it's a ghost town, though. There's nothing there. Probably one of those Class A towns. Yes, sir.
I get while the railroad went through what are now looked at as textile towns.
Yes, sir.
What was so hot about Hamburg? Why did the railroad go to Hamburg?
Because Savannah was actually a better port than Charleston was. Because in Charleston you had the Ashley and Cooper rivers, but they don't really go into the interior. In Savannah, you have the Savannah River, which goes all the way up, and then as it branches into the Tougaloo and, gosh, I forgot the name of the other ones, but you were able to get further into the interior. And so a lot of the South Carolina, upper South Carolina farms and businesses were shipping things down to Augusta. And Hamburg, that's an interesting story all in its own. There's a guy named Heinrich Schultz, Henry Schultz was how he Americanized it, who got upset with the town of Augusta and built his own town across the river. And that he somehow managed to convince the legislature to build the railroad to his town and not on across to Augusta. So that is how Hamburg became a prominent area. So there was a lot of shenanigans going on there, and that's one of the reasons why Hamburg became so important. Now, a lot of those rails are long gone, and we have another really good website, abandonrails.com/South Carolina. And this is an interactive map where you can actually click on these and get details about these abandoned routes. Some of these you know about because they've been made into very popular trails, like the Swamp Rabbit Trail. It may interest you to know that there are actually 3 railroads in South Carolina that were known as the Swamp Rabbit Railroad. There is the one we all know and love that goes up this way. This little branch starts right here. Going up this way was also known as the Swamp Rabbit Railroad. And going into Cherokee Falls, right through here, from Gaffney to Cherokee Falls, there was a railroad called the Swamp Rabbit Railroad. Of course, the one we remember is the one that's near us, that's been made into rails to trails. But a lot of these others have had the same thing. So like this branch of the McCormick Railroad is in the process of becoming a rails to trail. This branch right here that I mentioned previously from Alston, you can walk that trail. And then we have the Santee branch of the Palmetto Trail that also runs along a railroad. So these are the towns we're going to look at tonight: Manchester, Lone Star, Kingville, Reno, Chapels, and Tunnel Hill. Have any of you heard of any of these towns? Some of you have.
Is it Chapels? I've always heard Chappelle's.
Chapels is what I've always heard. Right. So we're going to take a look using this format. What was there? What happened to it? And what remains? If you were to visit that site now, what would you find? So our first one is Manchester, and we're going to hop a little bit to the west and look at Sumter Junction, because that's a part of that railroad town, and it's also quite interesting. Manchester is located in Sumter County, just on this side of the Santee River. Congaree, Wateree rivers come together to form the Santee River, just north of Lake Marion. If we are looking at old maps, which I dearly love, you will see that Manchester in 1825 was recognized as a town. Now, I do want to say a word about this map. In 1825, Robert Mills, who was a very famous architect. You probably heard his name if you have an interest in history. He commissioned a lot of map makers to map all of the districts as they were known at that time. And he published Mills' Atlas of the state and produced maps of each district. This is a small facsimile edition. The Greenville County Library in their South Carolina room has the full folio version. But you can find these online, both on the Library of Congress website, David Rumsey's historical maps, and scmemory.org, which are three very good websites to look at, and you can find these. And so I'll be popping up Mills' Atlas a couple of times during the talk, but there's Manchester. Notice, no railroads. This is 1825, prior to that 1827 establishment of the best friend of Charleston. It was just a small farming town. It was in Sumter County, we already mentioned that. The railroad came in the 1840s, and it transformed the village into a wild town. Had at least 7 stores and other businesses. Now, I'll point out this old newspaper article, Dark Corner Cullings. Now, just like the fact that there are multiple swamp rabbits, there were multiple dark corners. Just about every county had its own dark corner, which was removed from the judicial center and was usually the site of all sorts of illegal happenings like moonshining, whatever. Now, this town was known for its tavern, horse racing, cockfighting, gambling, and other illicit activities. The post office was active from 1817 to 1877. Here's another view, 1836, and we still don't see the post office there, so it just gives you an idea of where it is in relation to this river. 1840s, the Wilmington and Manchester Railroad came into being. They started issuing bonds for it, which you see on the left, and they started advertising it. This actually describes, I know you cannot see it, but it describes the mail route and its intended connections, which start New York and end in New Orleans. And here is an overall map showing New York up here, New Orleans down here, and this little bit right here from Wilmington to Manchester was the part they actually called the Wilmington-Manchester Railroad. I'm going to zoom in on this part right in here. Here's the railroad. Now, part of why they were doing this little dotted line, the text reads, present mail route. So if mail was coming from the north, they loaded it onto a boat in Wilmington and took it all the way to Charleston. And that was a very hazardous route. You have Frying Pan Shoals here, which has claimed lots of ships and boats, and it was just not a good route. So they were saying, buy our bonds because we've got a much safer route to get mail down to Charleston. In this 1890 description, this was secret, Sumter and its roads, reminiscences of Manchester. So this was a recollection of the town after it already started to die out. It said, when the company organized to construct the Wilmington and Manchester Railroad, Sumterville was only thought of as a way station, or Sumter as we know it now. The aim being to penetrate the southwestern part of the district to the most important point, Manchester. So Manchester was even more important than Sumter at that time. Then a thriving village with a famous tavern, well known to all travelers in the South Atlantic states. But many changes have been wrought in the district since that time. Manchester, the seat of wealth and prosperity, has fallen from her old estate. Her railroad torn up, the surrounding plantations deserted. There are no left but few old chimney stones piled carelessly one upon the other, and an ancient stunted cedar here and there to mark its site. Its old families have been scattered all over the states, and the name is all that remains of a once thriving village. That was from an 1890 edition of the Watchman and Southern, which was the local newspaper out of Sumter.
No, what I'm saying is, now,
Right, we'll get to that. That's okay. Another reminiscence of it, I want to jump down a little bit. It says it was a place where games of all kind were indulged in every Saturday, horse racing, cricket playing, etc. It was a common saying, if a stranger came into Manchester, you either had to fight or run. So it was a wild place. This one's from a 1901 edition of the same newspaper. So what happened? Sherman's March came through, destroyed all of the railroad, and the subsequent rebuilt railroads went through the town of Wedgefield, which is just north of the Manchester location. It was subjected to diseases, malaria, and so forth. So most of the town residents moved either to Wedgefield, Sumter, or any of the other surrounding towns. So what remains? That sign. That's it. There are no buildings or foundations. There's that historical marker, and it's south of the current town of Wedgefield, which itself is right on the verge of being a ghost town. The railroad name remained long after the town died out because it was still, that's just what they called it at the time. And then, as you mentioned, Manchester State Forest was named for the town. And that is an area that borders the Santee River. It's a managed forest area. Now, just west of there was a major railroad junction called Sumter Junction, or as you saw on the Hotchkiss map, or the Port Royal map, is also known as Watery Junction. And if you go there today, you'll find Woodhenge, which is kind of like the name I've seen given to it by others. It's located in this area. It was on it was a junction that connected the Charleston and Columbia line with the Manchester-Augusta line. And the Manchester Forest section of the Palmetto Trail follows a portion of that old rail line. And what you see there, if you go, are kind of like Stonehenge. You've got the old railroad ties where the trains went across the swampy areas, and you've got these huge pilings, and those are just off of the trail. You can see them if you walk along the trail. Now, this is a photo of the Palmetto Trail, which is a really nice trail. I've walked it and I've biked it, and it's great. So if you just look off to the side, you'll see these old pilings and supports for the trestles. And there's some of my friends to kind of give you a sense of scale. These guys here and the size of the posts. So that was Manchester. Now we're going to move a little closer in that area to a town that has one of the good old Western names. Lone Star, you would think, would be somewhere in the state of Texas. Well, it's not. It's actually fairly close to Manchester. In fact, it was on the Manchester to Augusta rail line. It's located just on the other side of the river there. And I like this town because it does have the feeling of one of those old West towns. There's still a lot there that you can visit and see. Now, in the late 1800s, the Manchester Railroad planned a town named Auburn for this location. Well, a railroad engineer came through. It was dark. Saw this bright light, must have been Venus or something. So he said, oh, that's where I saw that Lone Star. And so the name stuck. In 1894, now notice this is much later than Manchester, but they're still using the name Manchester Railroad. The PD Land Company started to buy up all the land bordering the railroads, and they started to sell lots, hoping that, kind of like a developing company around here would buy up lots along an interstate, hoping to build an industrial complex or apartments. So the same idea. This was a good example of a boom and decline. Initially, the town thrived. It had several stores, a church, and a school. But for whatever reason, the railroad didn't maintain a regular rail stop there. And because of that, the businesses started to decline early. Now this, I know, is hard to see, but the Sanborn insurance maps, anybody familiar with those? Okay, some of you are. They are a great way to find out about old towns. There's an excellent set of them for Greenville, and if you wanted to see what Greenville looked like in 1929, where all the stores were, you can visit the Greenville, and just look up Greenville historical maps of Google, and it'll take you to that, and they've got an interactive map. But you can also find these maps on some of the other locations that I mentioned. Now, this one was unpublished. What they would do is a surveyor would come out and mark off all of the buildings for fire insurance purposes. Now, in this case, we have some X's through some of these, so it's showing in 1929 that some of those buildings had already been torn down. In fact, this was the main railroad depot. The railroad came through here, and there's a little penciled arrow, which is impossible to see, and it shows it coming to here. What's left, this little bit right here, the rest of the depot had been torn down by 1929. So what happened? The town's ultimate demise was long and drawn out. In 1863, the longtime general store proprietor and postmaster, O.K. Ziegler, decided to retire. His wife, Mary, took over, and she was a force of nature. By the 1970s, there were still a few businesses in town, but the residents were taking the interstates and other highways into town for cheaper groceries. Now, the Postal Service really wanted to close that post office, but Mary Ziegler was personal friends with Strom Thurmond. And so she fought and was able to keep that post office going until 1995. So that's probably one of the latest ghost towns that we've got here. She finally relinquished. Her husband had died, and she just felt that she couldn't keep going anymore. This is what it looked like in the 1970s. There's a brick Masonic building. Here are some of the wooden stores, gas station, and this is good old O.K. Ziegler himself sitting in front of his store and post office. Looks like the post office sign has faded since then a bit. So what remains? This is a photo that I took. And we can see that the Masonic building is still there, and two of the original stores. And on down the road there is a church, but I can't tell. I have not been able to find any history on it. It looks like it's a little more contemporary, and I can't tell whether it's still an active congregation. I think it is an African-American church. I don't know. I haven't been able to find out. Here's some shots that I took of the individual buildings. You've got the depot, a couple of the stores. There was a little gas station across the railroad. All of these have now closed. And then there's Lone Star Barbecue. In the year 2000, Pat Williams purchased several of these buildings, including O.K. Ziegler's store and post office, and he moved them about 9 miles down to the town of Santee. And he kind of linked them together into a large dining area, had a lot of historical artifacts from the town of Lone Star there. In fact, those photos from the 1970s you saw was me taking a photo of their archives with my iPhone. And we used to love going there after we had been kayaking on Lake Marion. And I use that as past tense because this past Christmas Eve, there was a fire and it burned all of those historic buildings. Laura and I were driving through there not long ago, drove past there, and it's completely barren now. They say they're going to rebuild, but that's going to take a lot of coming back from. So sadly, that remaining area. But the town of Lone Star, with those buildings that I showed you, that's still there.
Did you find that? Did you find that on the current South Carolina road map if you're looking at highways?
Yes, you will.
Lone Star will be on that?
Yes, it's in Calhoun County now. If you're ever going to Low Falls Landing on Lake Marion, it's on the direct route to that. So you can also look for that. There's one other old store that was moved from Lone Star to Low Falls Landing, and It's the Low Falls Landing bait and tackle shop, and there's a character there by the name of Danny Daniels. And if you ever go down that way, stop in and see Danny, because it's amazing. He's a taxidermist, and so if you buy a candy bar, you got to look at a stuffed bobcat and all kind of other things that he's got there. And he will talk your ears off and tell you all kind of stories. He is an amazing guy. But his store is also one of the historical buildings that had been at Lone Star. So if you go to Lone Star, make sure you just go a few miles on down further to Low Falls Landing.
Tom, I have a question related
Yes, sir.
to the railroad
Okay.
in general. So, I'm a private individual. I decided that, I've got to have a railroad in front of my cotton mill or whatever. So we're going to sell some bonds, or either I'm going to get from the state, we're going to sell some bonds, etc. The land that the rails were built on, who owns that land?
The railroad company owns that land, and they own a certain amount of right-of-way for that. And it was usually obtained via eminent domain.
Okay.
One reason I know this is in the town that I grew up in, which was Graycourt, we owned a plot of land, and the railroad came across it, and we knew that there was a certain portion of it that we could not sell, because even though we held the title to it, we couldn't sell it because it was part of the railroad right-of-way. And then we had an industrial center come in just north of the little town there. They actually took a little bit more of that land. This was after we had already relinquished, we had moved out of that area, in order to put a spur railroad into that area. So
When Civil War comes, people actually leave the area because agriculture is not a thing now. The whole area is devastated.
yeah.
One, because of war. Two, we farmed out. We're stupid. We don't know that we can't plant cotton year after year after year.
Exactly.
So we have a lot of migration out of the state of South Carolina.
Right, so it's not just transportation, it's industrial changes as well. Yes, absolutely.
So my question is, now, the railroad disappears, who owns the land?
Well,
The state didn't take over the land? Or?
in some cases, I'm not enough of a real estate expert to know that. But that's a very good question, and I'd love to have the answer to that. I think in some cases, the railroad still remains ownership of that land. And I'm thinking specifically in terms of more modern railroads. They think, well, we might need that again to put another railroad through there. And so they retain those rights to that property. So next town. These are three towns are kind of forming a little triangle right here. We could call it the Railroad Ghost Town Triangle. Kingville. It's just north of the location we already saw. We had Manchester here, we had Lone Star here, and here's Kingville. Another one that I omitted, which would be a really good one to study sometime, is Fort Mott. It actually has history going back to the Revolutionary War, and it was an important location. But not covering it tonight because we're going to run out of time. There was a question as to whether it was Kingville or Kingsville. This 1870 map that I've shown you a couple of times already, here's Kingsville with an S. And there's Fort Mott that I mentioned, and there's Manchester, which I had mentioned, showing the railroad there. It got its name because it was the king of railroad junctions. It's a very ambitious name. It was established in 1840. There's that date again. That was probably like the boom town or boom time of these railroads being constructed. 1848, there was a spur line down to Aiken, and the town took off. Not quite as big as the other two, but it had two general merchandise stores, it had a bank, and a hospital, and I'll get to that in a bit, and amenities for travelers. This is a photograph, early 1900s, of the depot that was at Kingville. If you're looking for it on a map, it is now Kingville without the S. With that hospital, it became an important support area for Confederate troops. It was a major junction, so wounded soldiers were often dropped by there. There was a hospital established by the Young Ladies Hospital Association to provide food and drink for men in all uniform and aid the sick and injured in transit. Memoirs of William H. Wesson, who traveled through it about the time of the Civil War, says that he had gotten up a subscription, in other words, kind of like a GoFundMe site, I guess, put it in modern terms, for the relief of delayed and passing soldiers at the horrible place Kingsville, South Carolina. And then that delayed and half-famished soldiers were fed at Kingsville. There was also a refugee camp for displaced slaves from the Combi plantation and several other locations. That's really going to play into the history of Kingville in just a moment. This information came from the Friends of the Congaree newsletter. It was written by, gotten from Elizabeth Almy. This is from the National Register of Historic Places nomination form for Lower Richland, and it gives a good description of what happened during the Civil War. The county was particularly stricken by the Civil War, but precise property losses are difficult to calculate. I'm not going to read all of that. It just says Kingville flames consumed the hotel, depots, agents, about 3,000 feet of track. And what they did was they took the rails and they heated them in an intense fire, and they would wrap them around trees to form what was called Sherman's bow ties. And so that was one way that they destroyed a lot of the rails, not just here, but also in Manchester, which we saw earlier. Now, it became a hated travel hub, and part of this was due to plain old racism, because Kingville, that refugee camp, a lot of the white population had abandoned it, but it became a freedmen's town, and so they started to manage the amenities of the area, and some people just did not like that in a Reconstruction, pre-Jim Crow area. But a state newspaper article in November 1907 said it was simply a death hole. The article went on to state that the railroad employees were willing to forego their expenses as long as they did not have to spend the night in Kingville. It didn't help that it was right there in Congaree Swamp. And so you've got all the disease and heat and mosquitoes and all of that that's associated with the swamp. So what happened? Well, devastating floods hit the area. 1908 Watchman and Southern article describes that water was up an average of 7 feet around the station at Kingville. The station at Kingville was half covered water. Not as far as the eye could see was the tracks of the Southern Railroad is what they called it at that time. Other floods hit the town, and then we get to the good old highways bypassing the town. And then, as you mentioned, Bo Weevil's Great Depression caused the remaining businesses to go under. So in the 1940s, the Holly Hill Lumber Company bought all of the land, forced out all the remaining residents who moved to Gadsden nearby. And West Vaco now owns all of that land. This is a USGS topographic map, and I showed it because I want you to see where the railroad comes. It's still a very important rail line, even today. This junction still exists that comes here and here. The town of Kingville was located right about here, but in 1953, it shows Kingville here, and you can see that those buildings are no longer extant, but it's still an important rail junction. So what remains? It's got the historical mark, of course, but there are a few foundations and buildings, and in this case, they're not really from the town. They are from cottages and a boarding house that was constructed for the workers of Holly Hill. So they weren't really part of that, but they are in that same location. I visited it, took a few photos of it. There's still a sign on the railroad that says Kingville here. We could actually trace the streets because of these little green blotches right here, daffodils. The daffodils are not native to South Carolina. And so when you see daffodils in an open area, that's usually a good indication that it had been a habitation. And so we could see these lines of daffodils that marked out the former streets of the town. And we could find some stone markings that were some remnants of that town. And that's just off of that highway down that curves around that way. Doesn't mean that Kingville has been forgotten. Every June, in the town of Gadsden, they hold a Kingville celebration. They have a Kingville Historical Foundation, and it used to be reunion of the former residents, but there aren't that many former residents anymore. If there are any, they are quite old by this time. But it's still a celebration of the town's history. So that's Kingville. And now we're going to move a little further north to the very first ghost town I ever visited, Reno in Lawrence County. It's located in the eastern portion, that little pointy area of Lawrence County, and it was part of Jack's Township. And when I'm talking about ghost towns, that term comes up a lot, a township as opposed to a town. A township is more of a judicial area, kind of like a smaller part of a county. It's not the actual town. A township can hold several towns. And sometimes you'll see folks will refer to thus and such township when they're actually referring to the town. So those terms can get confused. But the area was settled in the 1700s. There are several historic churches there: Duncan Creek Presbyterian, Hurricane Baptist, and Sardis Methodist. The town was originally known as Reynosa. The post office was established in 1850, and the community began to kind of coalesce around that post office. In 1890, the Newberry Herald announced that the Georgia, Carolina, and Northern Railroad would put a depot on Mr. L.P.W. Riser's place near Reynosa. It is quite probable that the post office at Reynosa will be moved to the depot. And so what happened was they started shortening the name to Reno instead of Reynosa, just simply Reno. The town itself grew up along the Seaboard Rail Line, and at its peak it had 3 stores: a colored store, a blacksmith shop, a cotton gin, a telephone office operated in a local residence, a movie theater, and a passenger and freight depot. And that's from the National Register of Historical Places report. In 1912, a 2-story school was built to serve the area. The lower floor was the classrooms, and the upper floor was the auditorium. As a former school district administrator and as someone who has been involved in construction of several schools, I'm always fascinated by school architecture, and that seems to be the norm for a lot of the schools that were built during that time. And that became the center of the community because of that area that was for meeting on the 2nd floor. Now, that school was the first in the state to offer public transportation for students. They had a school wagon that was drawn by a horse named Rosin. That wagon could carry 13 students, and so that was the first public transportation, school transportation.
Was it yellow?
Good question. I'm not sure any photographs exist. Not far from there. Did you have a question? Yes.
Well, you mentioned the 2-story,
Yes, sir.
which I found interesting, but the country back where I come from, North Carolina, across into South Carolina, there's a very old building that's been there for years and years and years, and you can just look at it and say, I bet that used to be a school. It's a 2-story brick building, very strong looking building. I don't know how old it is.
I bet it was.
There's a road that runs by Ashmore School Road, so I guess that was the name of the school. I've never been able to find anything about it on Google or anything.
Well, I tell you what, my email addresses will come up at the end of this. Email me that question. I'll see what I can find, because I always love a mystery like that and try to find out. But I bet you that's exactly right.
Just one last thing. It's been abandoned.
Right.
It's kind of funny with the elderly gent who told me this, but now I passed by there going to my parents' place, but they're caregiving for. But anyway, someone has moved into it.
And that happens too. In fact, we'll see that with what happened with the Reno School in just a moment. Something similar. Now, near Reno was Stomp Springs, and this was part of that movement for health resorts, springs, there were cabins and a small store were built. They had a dance hall. This started around early 1900s. And in some ways, it was a way to get around Prohibition. They would have all kind of things going on there. And even up until the 1950s, bottles of Stomp Springs water were being sold in Columbia as part of a health fad. And interesting story. In fact, the guy who owned the property at that point built a lake and was hoping to build another resort, revive this resort. But that was another attraction to that particular area. I love this one because they held a bullfight there at the Hainbell Place near Reno, Lawrence County. The governor ordered the sheriff to stop it. Now, this is not a bullfight like with matadors, like you see. They actually had two bulls that were supposed to go at each other, and sort of like a cockfight. Said excursions had carried hundreds of people to the place. When the hour of the fight arrived, the two bulls strolled into the arena, looked at each other, made friends, and ended the sport in a very amusing manner. And that's from a Times and Democrat article, December 18th, 1902.
Now, I hate to interrupt, but that from the get-go reminded me of Reynosa, Mexico, and on the Mexican-Texas border.
And I'm wondering if that was going through their minds at the time. Yeah.
They used to have the bullfights there.
Yeah.
Is there some connection?
It could be. I'd never thought about that until you mentioned it just now, but yeah, there could have been. So what happened? Well, Depression came to South Carolina long before the 1929 stock crash. And that ties in with World War I because we had ramped up to do food production and all this other production for the war effort, and then it was not needed. So those businesses started to collapse. Most of the farmers lost their land during the Great Depression. Many moved to Clinton, Lawrence, and started working in the mills. The farms were eventually sold to large timber concerns. Post office closed in 1949. There was a Dun & Bradstreet report that said that in 1920 there were 3 stores remaining in Reno. By 1942, only one remained, the Bell General Store. That's the same Hain Bell who had the bullfight. So what remains? There's the railroad crossing, and there's still a farm community there. The stores and the depot have long been removed. There's several houses in various states of decay. It looks like some are being rebuilt, others are no longer extant. One remaining store that belonged to Johnny Bell, a relative of Hain Bell, and it's been deteriorating rapidly. I took this photo in 2008, and you can see that there were still lots of walls. Visited it again in 2011. That's what was left, so the only 2 walls remaining. I haven't been back through there to see what's left of that. It could, by now, completely be torn down, for all I know. Now, as for the school, this is a school insurance photograph, which is available on the South Carolina Archives website, circa 1940, and it shows the upper floor and then the 2 lower floors, and there's an interior view of one of the classrooms.
That's reminiscent of a building that's now a wedding venue. It's on 290.
Okay.
Are you familiar with it?
Yes.
290 out of Greer?
Yes, that's the old, I know the name of the school, but I can't bring it to mind, but very similar to that. In the 1990s, the house was turned into a residence, and it was turned into more of a halfway house residence. And so they had services for alcoholics, for whomever needed those services there. And something happened where it burned. This photo was taken in 2008. You can see that by 2011, it was down to nothing but the steps and foundation. 2019, you'd have to know where that school was in order to recognize it, because it's just completely overgrown.
It looks like the school I'm talking about.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder if the same building schools across South Carolina.
They have such distinctive architecture. The school that I attended in Gray Court and where I started teaching originally was designed on that same plan, where they had elementary, or they had classrooms on the lower floor and an open area on the upper floor. Okay, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to try to skip through these. I'm willing to keep going if you guys are willing to listen. Okay, all right. Chapels or chapels or however it's pronounced. I've heard chapels all my life. I think chapelle, if you had an extra E on it, it would use that, the French version. It's located in Newberry County, somewhat south of Lake Greenwood, right on the Saluda River. And the Saluda River plays an important part in this town because it was originally known as Chapel's Ferry. And notice that in Mills Atlas, 1825, it's spelled C-H-A-P-P-L-E instead of E-L-L. However, I think that was just well, you can't really say it's a typo because it was hand-drawn. The guy just didn't know how the name was spelled. And here's the question, but wait, isn't Chapel still there? This is a Google Map view, and it shows the crossroad of Highway 39, Highway 34, and you see the town here, the community. But right here it says Old Main Street. That's where Chapel's actually is. And we'll get there. Thomas Chapel settled in the 1700s. He wanted a way to get across to his neighbor's farm across the river, so he petitioned the legislature for to start a ferry. And he also established a store nearby that ferry because it became a very popular crossing. Obviously, if by 1825 they were referring to it as Chapel's Ferry. And it was known as that through the Revolutionary and on past the Civil War. And after the Civil War, William Smith operated the ferry, and then he said, okay, this ferry's not working, I'm going to build a bridge. So he built a wooden bridge across the Saluda for carts and so forth to get across. In the late 1800s, the Columbia and Greenville Railway came through, and instead of Chapel's Ferry, the area became known as Chapel's Depot. From the South Carolina Railroad photo collection, here's a photo of the depot at Chapel's. So what happened? John Abney Chapman is a historian who writes about Newberry, or who wrote about Newberry. It says, efforts have been made to make Chapel's Depot on the G and CRR a place of business, but with only moderate success. There are some stores there and considerable business is done. On the 19th of February, 1884, the great cyclone or tornado struck it and swept the whole concern away. Some persons were killed and others were very seriously injured. It was also said that it toppled a train at the depot at the time of that storm. That was just the first of several disasters to hit that town. It was rebuilt. There were several stores, cotton gin, post office, and even a doctor and a bank in the area. Fires in the 1900s destroyed some of the businesses. And in his book, The History of Newberry County, Thomas Pope states that the improved roads then being constructed proved to be the death knell of the little villages in Newberry County. So once again, transportation changes combined with those disasters kind of wiped out the town. Barbara Holloway Smith is a historian who goes around and gives talks specifically on Chapels, and she was kind enough to share several photos of this. This is E.L. Cook, who was in charge of the bank, and it was said that it's the only bank supposedly in the U.S. where all the investors got their money back after the Great Depression. We've got the 1926 Sanborn map. I'm not going to spend much time on it. It shows several places of business as well as the depot. The depot is located down here. The tracks run this way, but much of it is already listed as vacant by the time that 1926 map was produced. Chapel School got hit by a tornado. It was rebuilt. It followed that very similar plan, and you could recognize, yep, that's a school by looking at it. You can't really see it in this, but right through here, there's a discoloration in the bricks where they rebuilt it. So that upper part in this photo is new, is rebuilt after that tornado. There's the 1926 version of the wooden bridge, and it had this nice little emblem. The Southern Railroad serves the South. So more of what happened. 1927, a flood wiped out the remaining businesses and washed away the Saluda Bridge, that wooden bridge you just saw. And then we had the stock market crash. There's another one of Barbara Smith's photos showing the flooded stores. In 1931, a new steel truss bridge was built across the Saluda River for Highway 39, bypassing the main street, which now became a dead end. And so with all of the traffic routed on this bridge, the town, what was left of it, started to die out. So what's there? Well, if you go to the intersections of 34 and 39, there's a convenience store and the ever-present Dollar General. And I've just gotten to the point where, if it's a Dollar General, I'm just going to discredit that and not let it take away from what there was there. The Old Million Street is a dead-end street, but it's still a public street. You can still drive down it and circle around. You see ends of two of my kayaks there as I was driving down for a kayaking trip. The remnants of the businesses can be found all along Old Main Street, including a gas station, a store, and a wood-frame church. This was a gas station. It was kind of overgrown, but it has a portico that comes out, and the pumps were located in between those columns. The largest structure was an old store, and there's another structure to the right of that you can just barely see that's missing a roof. This was the church, and the last time I visited there, it was precariously leaning against a sapling. So whether it's still standing or not, I don't know. I kind of doubt it. Another view of that store. From this side, you can get a better view, and you can see that it actually was connected to another building to the left there at some point. And those remains are still visible if you were to go down the Old Main Street and see them. And we get to the last one, Tunnel Hill, located in Oconee County north of Walhalla. And it was a true boom town. Blue Ridge Railroad was an ambitious plan to develop a railroad that crossed the mountains through the gaps into, they wanted to start and go initially into Knoxville, which is here, but the ultimate goal was to get up to Cincinnati. Why Cincinnati? I don't know. But that was the plan. And so it was known as the Charleston and Cincinnati Railroad at one point. It had various names. But there were multiple routes that were proposed, one of them being the Swamp Rabbit Railroad, the Greenville and Northern Railroad. That was originally supposed to go past the River Falls area and on up into Charleston. Of course, it only made it as far as River Falls. Not Charleston, Asheville. But John C. Calhoun advocated for another route that would go into Rabun County, and that was the one that was eventually settled upon. It was chartered in 1852, and construction was begun on Calhoun's route. And much as was the case with the Wilmington and Manchester Railroad, they sold bonds. This is from the Oconee County Museum. I took that photo from there. The town of Belton sprung up to facilitate construction of that railroad. It was where that railroad would branch off and where the Greenville branch took off. It would require at least 13 tunnels through the mountains and multiple bridges. So it was a very, very ambitious railroad project. 3 of the tunnels were to be built in South Carolina, with the rest in Georgia and Tennessee. The most famous one, the crown jewel, was Stump House Tunnel, the tunnel that goes through Stump House Mountain. It'd be nearly a mile long, and if completed, it would have been the longest railroad tunnel in the United States. And I'm not sure whether that's at that time. I think there are probably some much longer than that now, modern tunnels. But the 2 other tunnels were Saddle Tunnel and Middle Tunnel. And to support this, the town of Tunnel Hill, so you've got the tunnel here, Stump House Tunnel, and on top of that, they built a town. And it was populated by the workers. George Collier and company brought in Irish and German immigrants to start working on the tunnels. And by the time construction began, there were 1,500 people living in that town, which was a huge population for that particular time. It sprung up to accommodate the influx of workers, and town is a rather loose term. Life was rough in this spot in the middle of nowhere. It was a violent place, had saloons, and fights would often break out between the immigrant workers and the local population who thought that jobs were being usurped from them. Sound familiar? Things never change, it seems like. But there were reports of at least 2 murders in the town. Even so, according to an 1897 article, Tunnel Hill had several stores, a hotel, boarding houses, a school, a Catholic church, and the usual complement of bar rooms. Reverend J.J. O'Connell was that Catholic priest, and he visited the area, and he said that in 1854, he says that practically all the dwellings were flimsy wooden frame-built structures that provided little shelter from the elements, while miners with families lived in primitive cabins. Unmarried miners often lodged in boarding shanties provided by other railroad workers and their families. And O'Connell did not like the drinking. In fact, he established a temperance society that played a large part, or at least that he tried to get going in that area. So what happened? Funding. That's the main issue. 1859, there was a large celebration held in the town, a big parade. They had rifle companies, they had bands, they had barbecue, they had all kinds of things coming through. 5,000 people attended. There were speeches by then Governor Gist, General Wade Hampton, and Major Benjamin Perry, who was from Greenville. And Perry became governor a little bit later. Despite the celebration, the legislature did not appropriate the funds that were needed for it. With the coming of the Civil War, the project was completely halted. The middle tunnel and almost 5,000 feet of the Stump House Tunnel had been completed. Saddle Tunnel was not completed at all. Confederate deserters used the abandoned town as a frequent stop, looting what was left, and they actually used pieces of the church and other buildings for firewood. There were some attempts to keep it going. Even as late as 1940, they said, you know, we could still do this. This one article in 1907 says nearly 80% of the grading over the mountains was completed, so why don't we keep going with this? It was only completed from Belton to Walhalla. And at this point, it's still an active railroad, but only from Belton to the town of West Union, which is up near Seneca area. In the 1950s, Clemson University purchased the tunnel for the production of blue cheese. And so they used it for that purpose for about a decade and a half until they were able to replicate some of the conditions of the tunnel within their own location there for curing blue cheese. So what remains? Well, the only remnant of the town is the old cemetery. There's no recognizable headstones, only a few field stones to mark the graves. And that area has now been closed off. You can't even get up there anymore. At the time, there were some trails that would lead up to that area and into the ventilation shafts. Nearby is an old foundation of cinder blocks, but it really looks like it's a little too modern for the Tunnel Hill era. But the name remains. There is a road called Tunnel Hill, and there's a nearby convenience store called the Tunnel Hill Gas Station. But of course, the main thing is the tunnel itself, which is part of a county park. A developer tried to buy it not too long ago, wanted to put condos, whatever, onto it, and the county was able to procure it. There are trails that lead to nearby Sequina Falls, to the now collapsed middle tunnel, and to the site of the saddle tunnel. So that ends our tour of 6 of South Carolina's railroad towns. Thank you. Abe.
If you were to visit one of these towns to experience, what would you recommend is the best place?
I would say if you've never been to Stump House Tunnel, go there because it's a really cool place to visit. But for the other ones, go to Lone Star. Yeah, because it's got a real good feel of a ghost town. But the other ones are really interesting places. Kingville, you can't really get to. Manchester, there's nothing there really to see unless you hike the Palmetto Trail and look at Woodhenge. But there are several others. Yes, sir.
40 years ago, I took my kids to Stump House Tunnel and camped out there many good times. There's Wizard Falls all around the area.
Yeah, beautiful area. Highly recommend it. Other questions?
You do this presentation on Lost Railroad Town, and then you do another one on Underwater Town.
Yes, the towns under South Carolina lakes.
That one would be good if you had to do it again.
Okay.
Podcasts on that, etc.?
I do, as a matter of fact. In the podcast, what I do is I take one town and go into a little bit more detail than we went into this. And I try to find somebody that has lived in the area or knows about the area that I can interview and get some more history on that.
Because I just was up at Circassian last weekend, and there's a history there. Real quick, are you a railroad enthusiast?
Not per se. I'm a ghost town but enthusiast. But the railroads play such an important history in these that just by way of research, I come across a lot of these things. Yes, sir.
Off subject here, but my curiosity sparked. I had a friend of mine years ago that he hunted on some private land down around in South Carolina, Peckalock area, somewhere down there. There was some he had some photographs, and to me, a ghost town is an abandoned town, the one that is there, but there's a creepy element involved in it.
Yeah.
So just look at those pictures that look kind of creepy. So you can't get to it because it's on private property. Very little standing, but he told me that it was considered to be one of the sites for West Point.
It was. You're talking of the town of Pinckneyville. Pinckneyville. Yes, I've done a podcast episode on that. That one was supposed to be the judicial center of that region because all of northern South Carolina was known as the 96th District. They subdivided that into the Pinckney District and the Spartanburg District, I believe. And then when they broke that, Pinckneyville was in the middle of that Pinckney District. But when they broke that further down into counties and districts, it was right on the border, and they said, well, Union is more in the center of this new county of Union, so let's make that the courthouse. And so because it was no longer the judicial center, that's why it died out. But yeah, if you ever want to visit it, go to the Union County Museum, and they've got a really good display there, and if you talk nicely to them, they'll give you the key to the gate so that you can drive down there, but there are no buildings or anything left. Historical markers there, that's it. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm recording this. This will be a longer version of one of my podcast episodes. It'll probably come out, I'm thinking after Thanksgiving, because I've got another one that I'll be putting together at some point. And Michael would like for you to fill out these and let us know how you heard about this. So thank you. Thanks for listening to this bonus special episode. My thanks to Michael Evans from the Mauldin Branch of the Greenville County Library for inviting me to give the lecture, and to all those that attended. Be sure to join us next time as we do a deep dive into another Carolina ghost town.
In this southern ghost town, we found a story untold. In the shadows of the past, we unravel, secrets unfold. With each step we take, we journey back in time. In this this southern ghost town, we leave our footprints behind.
Thanks for listening. The opening music was composed by Lex FM with additional music from Pixabay. The song Southern Ghost Town was generated by Suno AI. All other music was composed and recorded by me, Tom Taylor. Carolina Ghost Towns is a part of the Random Connections empire. It's pretty much a one-man show, so I wear all the hats, including producer, writer, researcher, sound engineer, publicist, and bartender. If you like the show, please subscribe on your favorite pod venue and be sure to give us feedback. If you have questions, comments, or ideas for the show, you can reach me at carolinaghosttownspod@gmail.com. For more information and show notes, visit randomconnections.com. Thank you.
In this southern ghost town, we found a story untold. In the shadows of the past, we unravel, secrets unfold. With each step we take, we journey back in time. In this southern ghost town, we leave our footprints behind.
Random Connections.